So, Mothering Sunday. And I'm going to start with a lot of what might seem like rather just disjointed things today, because that's how this sermon came to me. It came to me in sort of a wave of fragments until eventually it put it together. And it began for me when I got up last Monday morning and thought, oh, I've got to write a sermon for Sunday. Well, I had on the radio, and I don't know if anybody else listens to Radio 4 first thing in the morning, but there was a talk on the radio about George Eliot. And I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the fact that, in fact, she was a woman called Mary Ann Evans till she married. And I think she was Mary Ann Lewis after that. And she wrote several excellent books, including my mother's favourite, The Mill on the Floss. And The Mill on the Floss was set in Lincolnshire and seemed to describe a world that my mother had known her whole life. The Mill on the Floss was described by reviewers as the outward rush of the river of life in which the soul is swept along. And it does feel like that sometimes, that life is just a rush of water, isn't it? Carrying you from place to place. And your soul does get swept along. This Mill on the Floss was actually written as 7 books. And these are the titles of each of the books: Boy and Girl, School Time, The Downfall, The Valley of Humiliation, Wheat and Tares, The Great Temptation, and The Final Rescue. And I'm sure that those of you who have been reading your Bibles for a while will recognize some of those words as being relevant. Wheat and tares, the valley of humiliation makes you think of Psalm 23, the great temptation, the final rescue. Now, so a critic at the time, when he heard that George Eliot might not be a man, shock horror, absolute shock horror, actually wrote it was too good a story to have been written by a woman. Now, I'm going to be very restrained and not comment further on that critique, but that says a lot, doesn't it? And perhaps explains why she decided to write as George Eliot and why the Brontes wrote as Currer and Ellis, and they took male names too. Because this was one of my mother's favourite books, the radio programme set me to thinking about her. She died aged 100 in 2017. That's my mother there, very much younger than that, with her mother. Now, in 1928, I know that's back a long, long while ago, at the age of 11, my mother thought her dreams for the future were over. They were shattered. She got rheumatic fever and couldn't sit the 11+ exam. And that meant that this highly literate girl who loved poetry and reading had to stay at primary school until she was 14. And the curriculum changed so that now she was learning about laundry and ironing. So that when she left school, as you had to in those days, at the age of 14, she was prepared to get a job. However, they didn't really know my mother, although I can't imagine how she must have felt at the age of 11, feeling that her future was so damned, really. But she was determined. So at 14, she did go and get a job, but she also went to night school, and she studied bookkeeping and typing and shorthand, and was able to get a job as an office junior after a couple of years. And that was to be the start of a very successful career. And it also gave her time to train at nights as a Red Cross nurse, which made her very useful when war broke out, because she worked all day and then was a Red Cross nurse all evening and night. So on the same morning that I heard this programme about George Eliot and was thinking about my mother, I read in my newspaper the account of a woman called Ellen Widdop, who is the managing director of a very successful business. And this is what she wrote. Let's start with a sob story. I am a single mother to 3 neurodiverse children, 2 with autism and a 3rd with ADHD. About 6 years ago, my husband walked out on us, citing being overwhelmed with our home life. There was no warning. There was no explanation. He reached his breaking point, and there was no discussion to be had. I sat on the floor bawling, wondering what to do next. And she did add, she wondered what had exhausted him and overwhelmed him, given that he was at work all day and then came home and expected her to put a meal on the table in front of him. But she went on to say, nobody prepares you for a moment like that. Nobody tells you that you have to put on every resource, every ounce of resilience, every part of your being that is struggling to put one foot in front of the other, let alone make macaroni cheese and help with the maths homework. Now, I suspect that Ellen's words will ring true for many people, suddenly finding themselves alone and having to cope as a single parent, as well as earn a living. My 3rd and slightly random thought of the day came after reading the Gospel for today that I've just read about the man cured of blindness. And the account began with Jesus seeing a man on the roadside who had been blind since he was born. And the disciples asked Jesus whether he was blind because of his own sins or because of his sins of his parents. Now, there were some very weird ideas around at the time of Jesus, that babies in the womb were already capable of sin, and that's why they kicked to be let out. I'm sure all of you who have had babies will find that an interesting idea. Another idea was that when you were born, you were either allocated a good or a bad soul. The writer of the Book of Wisdom said, as a child, I was naturally gifted and a good soul fell to my lot. A 3rd and more popular idea, which is found throughout the Old Testament, is that the sins of the fathers are inherited by the children. And you can find references to that through Exodus and Numbers and Isaiah, as well as in the Psalms. I've quoted here Psalm 109. May the iniquity of his father be remembered before the Lord, and do not let the sin of his mother be blotted out. So it's thus quite possible that the Jewish leaders, hearing about Jesus curing the blind man, wanted to know what was going on. And the first thing they do is question the man's parents, because they think that this cure is probably a con trick and he'd never really ever been blind. And the parents are clearly terrified about being shut out from society and punished because the sins of the father are laid upon the child. They are thinking this is what everyone's going to be saying. So they just state the facts to the Jewish leaders. They know this man is their son, that he's always been blind, and if the authorities want to know anything else, then they say, you must ask the man, as he's an adult and can answer for himself. So the leaders asked the man, who answers very simply, I was blind and now I can see. The authorities then ask who did this thing, and the man said, I've already told you, and you don't want to listen. Surely you're not asking me all this so you can become one of his disciples. And the man tells them that if this man was not from God, then he could not have done what he did. Now the Jewish leaders are then furious. And what happens? He's punished. He is excommunicated from his synagogue as a punishment for speaking the truth, for just telling them what had happened. So the authorities resorted to age-old tactics for dealing with an argument or a disagreement. First you abuse someone, then you insult them, and then you threaten force. I think nothing has changed much from that day to this, that insult, abuse, and threaten force tactics are still used. So why have I joined up these three apparently random things for a Mothering Sunday sermon? So let's go back to this description of the book my mother loved so much, and critics claiming that it described the outward rush of the river of life in which the soul is swept along. I think that describes not just the book, but the lives of so many mothers in particular, including Ellen Widdup, who I quoted earlier. I am confident that if I went round and spoke to each of you individually and asked you to say something about your mother, you could tell me tales of resilience and loving care in the face of hard work, hardship, hard times. Washing machines and dishwashers and vacuum cleaners and cars may have made a lot of difference, but there is still pressure in this constant and rushing river of day-to-day life. And parents, particularly mums, I think, are constantly pulled in many different directions, as if they are tossed on wild water, which they cannot control, because the river of life continues to rush along. The parents of that blind man in the gospel must have been absolutely terrified by the cross-questioning they received and the threats against them. But you know, they must have done something right, because their son spoke up proudly for himself, and he was absolutely clear about what had happened, despite the threats being made against him. So the outward rush of that river of life in which the soul is swept along. He was carried away in all that was happening to him, but his soul was also swept along. And he was able to make a very clear declaration when Jesus, hearing that the man had been kicked out of his community, went to find him and asked, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" And the man said, "Lord, I believe." So let us, this Mothering Sunday, feel confident to speak with him. And join with me and say together, "Lord, I believe."